Mark, you gave, Nislam Niflos is one of my favorite examples of the brilliance of the translation. I saw it very late in its sort of final run, and sitting there thinking, like, everything that you said about that language is true, but also it's so organic. It's something that someone would actually say. So he finds things that work beautifully lyrically, but also he's not forcing square pegs into round holes. And there's so many examples throughout the lyrics. And it's worth noting, Schrager Friedman also, and he was a very experienced man of the theater, and he translated, of all things, My Fair Lady into Hebrew. I mean, that's a show about language. That's, a musical. I mean, that is an act of tremendous chutzpah.
The other thing to say, particularly about Nisim Lef Niflos, is that it's anchored and rooted in Jewish tradition. I mean, it's a part of liturgy, and that's what makes the translation so rich.
Very interesting. So I'm doing a production of Fiddler right now. Yeah, you're all invited. I'll have postcards. We had a lot of discussion about the Russian, and I wanted to know in the Yiddish version. So the Russian is not really Russian. I don't know if anybody knows that it's not actual words. And so Zava Zhastarovia, heaven bless you both, the word is Nastarovia, okay? And it's Nastrovia is not correct. And so we're doing it Nastarovia. And I don't know if you noticed if the Russian was changed at all in the Yiddish version.
I don't know. It could be. I just didn't, that didn't hit me, didn't focus on it. All right, so this is...
Interesting thing we've been having this discussion because we have a lot of Ukrainians in the production. And they say you can't say Nastrovia, it's Nastarovia. So that's how we're doing it.
That's great. So this is Noreen Green, who's directing Fiddler on the Roof early June at...
I have postcards for everybody.
So if you want to see Fiddler...
All right. We'll put some on the front table so you all can make sure you grab them.
One of the things that's, I think, very telling in that moment in the show is that what the Jews sing back is not the same. They sing, "May you live together in peace." That line is not in Russian in any form.
Oh, really?
Yeah, only...
Wait, in the Yiddish? It's not in Yiddish?
Well, it's part of the song, so I imagine...
So they do the Russian and they go into Yiddish to your help, So
right,
they
but it's
say
just
all
to...
that in Yiddish. What do the Russians say? Do they say it in Yiddish or do they say it in Russian?
I don't know. I'll have, does anyone else notice that when they saw the show?
I think they say I think they must say it in Russian.
Your help and may we live together in peace is what the Russians say, right? So do they say it in Yiddish or do they say it in Russian?
Yeah.
Aha! I found a question that needs to be answered.
Well,
Interesting. All right.
my assumption is it's in Russian, right? Because it's... Yeah.
All right. Mark.
Just a small thing. Did Joel Gray talk about the gigantic Torah in the back, which struck me as the most egregious aspect of this whole production?
Why?
Why? Why is it there? I mean, Torah. Looming over this entire story. I don't know. Did he talk about that choice?
We asked him, but he didn't really have a real answer. So I don't know. I guess we could ask Zalman. I mean, Joel didn't have an answer to it.
Ruthie?
Thank you. This was really interesting. When I saw the show, it was performing in the Jewish Heritage Museum. I think it's also another aspect of this performance, making it a sort of site-specific performance as part of the museum. I think it was, for me, it was very sort of strong to be in the Jewish Heritage Museum to see the fiddler in Yiddish, vis-a-vis, Yiddish as a sort of sonic sign and memory, of course.
Thank you both so much for this. This was so much fun. As I mentioned to you, I think before you started today, I saw the Yiddish Fiddler 3 times in various contexts, all in the Yiddish, all in the museum, as Ruthie mentioned. And for me, part of what struck me about watching the production was that I was in the Yiddish language summer program, so fully immersed in the Yiddish language study while seeing this production multiple times. And I had this feeling as I was watching the production that it almost should have been in Yiddish the whole time. And of course it was, right? It's this translation it's a translation returning to a translation, which is a very interesting cultural experience. And so I wondered, like, you had said that in some respect, the experience of watching this was, you know, an emotional trigger, that the sonic element of the Yiddish language provided that. But I wondered if you had had any sort of discussions with Joel about this language return and sort of the implications of returning a story to a language it should have been in the whole time.
Do you know what he said about that?
I think, yeah, I mean, it was always a part of the concept. So, I mean, that was the reason for doing it. So it didn't really come up as a choice in that sense. Yeah. And so it became, well, what do we do with that choice? And for him, it was making it about the family, making it about the things that we, you know, a way of accenting a lot of what we see and hear, other than the English language, which does not communicate the same way, right?
So what I'm about to say doesn't exactly answer the question, but I think it's interesting. And it is that when Joel was initially asked to be a part of the show, one of the questions was, would he play Tevye? And Joel was well into his 80s, and at that point was not singing in public anymore. So he said he had always wanted to play Tevye, but you know that really wasn't going to happen. Then they asked him to direct the show, and I don't know that it swayed him whether or not it was in Yiddish in the beginning, but he did. I do remember him saying that, you know, doing in Yiddish is really an homage to his father. You know, I mean, I think that's where the whole family thing comes. And in his own memoir and the many discussions we've had with him, he talks so emotionally about his father. And what's interesting is that when Joel was a child, they were living in Cleveland, and in his teens, the family moved in 1948 to LA as a part of being with Spike Jones, for Mickey Katz to play with Spike Jones. And Joel went to Hamilton High School, which is still known for being a big performing high school, and he was in some productions there. But he really didn't have any breakout hits. I mean, he actually had auditions as a child actor on Broadway, never landed anything. And he felt very frustrated as a teenager. His father's show by 1949, Borshkapades, was running in 49 and 50. Joel was about 17 around that time, and he really wanted to be in his father's show, but his father didn't give him much attention. So his aunt taught him Romania, Romania. So he sang Romania, Romania for his father, and his father said, yeah, we got to put that in the show. And then they said, we'll announce you coming out as Joel K., because they didn't want anyone to think that Joel Gray's son was coming out, and they only said that afterwards. So the beginning of his name change began with that. But what I think is so interesting, and I put this question to Joel, I don't think he thought much of it, but I thought it was interesting that here Yiddish theater, a quintessential Yiddish theater song, you know, was his calling card to be not only in this show, but it's what Eddie Cantor saw him do that gave him his breakout, you know, live, you know, performance on TV through Eddie Cantor, was after Eddie Cantor saw him sing Romania, Romania. And what Joel kept on saying to us is that he doesn't understand a word of Yiddish. He said he knows Mickey Katz Yiddish. And so, you know, I think that for him, you know, he wasn't coaching, you know, any of the Yiddish, you know, in it. So I think that, I don't think that the Yiddish was the sway for him, but I think that he got drawn in by it. That's what I got out of it. What do you think? Yeah.
Okay, we had a question here.
Thank you so much for the beautiful presentation. I was just thinking about the role of Fiddler as a kind of like a cultural pedagogy. How do people learn what being Jewish is supposed to sound like? And so the Yiddish theater is so heavily predicated on these kind of cliched markers of Jewish sound, or stylized versions of what Jewishness is that are then put back together as a theatrical presentation. And it raises questions about, well, where does that idea of these kinds of sounds, like the krechts and these kinds of intonations in speech, is their Jewishness a result of some kind of innate quality in the culture that precedes the theater, or was it kind of instantiated in that? And then Yiddish Fiddler then refers to that to kind of reify and strengthen these kinds of markers as strongholds of Jewishness. And then you have these very, very beautiful personal reflections of hearing the work and responding to it as being this kind of call to the soul. So where did you learn that that is what your soul sounds like? And what role does media play in creating this kind of sense of intimacy?
Yeah, that's great.
So one of the things that I would say about that, it's interesting that you think about pedagogy, because that's obviously true, but it's not really the way Broadway works. Broadway works by pulling on things that people will instantly recognize as something. It has to use a kind of shorthand. That's why there's so many stereotypes and cliches on Broadway, because you immediately have to communicate. I think over time, the pedagogy starts to happen because people familiar with the show understand it that way. But the initial impulse for writing a show like this in a certain way, and for hiring an actor who can do that, in Zero Mostel, who knows all of that very, very well, it's part of his body language, everything, right, is to just communicate very quickly that this is what it is, or what is, so people know what it is. So it's interesting, because I think that also has to do with that, the thing that I was talking about early on, between the idea of live theater in the way theater works and the way that it becomes ritual, and if it's more familiar. So there's another thing it becomes pedagogical generationally, and that's interesting. Thank you for that.
Okay, Daniela, then David.
Just a very quick question. When I first encountered these Yiddish productions, the Golden Akala and then the Yiddish Fiddler, I was surprised to see the Russian subtitles. I was wondering what the thinking was, who those were intended for, and yeah, why?
I mean, my understanding is, I've gone to Folksbiene productions since I went to New York in the 80s, and they always had Russian. I think that there's just such a large Russian-speaking Jewish community in New York that they want to pull together to see the show. Who don't know Yiddish, right, exactly.
I'm wondering if either of you know anything about the challenges that might have been faced by the composer arrangers who had to take the Yiddish language and put it on top of this music that had been written for English language.
Yeah, I don't recall anything in the conversations I had about that. On English words, yeah.
All right, last question.
So first, a quick answer to Mark's question. I think these people are living under clouds, under multiple clouds. They're living under the clouds of the Russian Empire. They're living under the cloud of the tradition of Torah and Hasidic life, and they're living under the cloud anachronistically of the impending Holocaust, which I know is 50 years later, but still coming. So I think that some of those clouds are palpable and some of them are implied. So here it's made a little more clear. Sure, that's true. But a question for you. Speaking of anachronism, or at least counterfactualism, how do you think we would feel about this musical if it were done originally in Yiddish?
Yeah,
Well, it probably wouldn't have run for 8 years or whatever on Broadway. So for one thing, we wouldn't have it. I mean, I think it really needed to become an institution for something like this to make any sense for anyone.
And in point of fact,
it did.
Stories were dramatized numbers of times.
Yeah, in Yiddish. In Yiddish. So, I mean, this is where it came from. That's what I alluded to. And plus, it was translated pretty quickly for Israel, right? There was a Hebrew version, but there was also a Yiddish version.
very soon after. Right?
Right.
Okay.
All right, thank you so
you.
much. We're at time. Thank you, Mark and Ray.